I think everybody agrees that renewable energy is a great thing. It's just a matter of how it's produced and where it's produced.
We have this amazing renewable energy resource here, wind, offshore wind, that's blowing by us all the time. And to not capture that seems really unfortunate.
But I think this is the crack in the door that's going to open up offshore wind farm up and down the East Coast.
The world is currently faced with rising temperatures caused by greenhouse gases. General apathy and neglect from a large section of our government makes climate change the most difficult problem that faces our generation. Since the Industrial Revolution, humanity has used fossil fuels to power everything from our cars to our coffee makers. Coal, petroleum, and natural gas are the main sources of energy used worldwide. 80% of greenhouse gas emissions come from those three sources. The global average temperature is projected to rise up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the year 2100, and by that time, our sea levels will have risen by up to 6.6 feet. Reducing the mass production of greenhouse gases will drastically lower the rate at which our Earth is warmed. The United States is in the midst of a huge transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy by setting goals for energy production.
Many states have them. They're known as RPS or RES, Renewable Energy Standards. There's no federal standard yet, but I think it's something like 30 states have them now. They generally run along the lines of 2020, so 20% of your power should come from alternative energy by the year 2020.
The first offshore wind project in the United States was proposed almost 20 years ago off the shores of Cape Cod. And at that time, Massachusetts and New England in general had a robust and diverse energy portfolio based on coal, nuclear energy, oil, and natural gas. Since then, hydraulic fracturing has produced cheap and abundant natural gas. This, as well as a hesitancy to build more coal and nuclear plants, has caused New England to rely almost exclusively on natural gas for its electricity. This over-reliance on one energy source has alarmed regulators and lawmakers. A disruption to the natural gas supply could have tremendous consequences to the energy stability of New England.
We really try to talk about savings and comfort, because what we have come to understand is that people don't want to give up anything. They don't want it to be a sacrifice to actually be doing something good for the environment.
Massachusetts has set high renewable energy goals, both to address climate change and to meet the demands left by old coal and nuclear plants going offline. The 9-state Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative proposed a New England carbon emission reduction plan. This proposed plan would reduce emissions from Connecticut, Delaware, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, Rhode Island, and Vermont.
So we put out this Energy Vision 2030, which looks at, for the 6 New England states and New York, what do we need to do to actually get to the climate commitments that we've made? So a number of these states, I'll use Massachusetts as an example, has made a commitment to have 80% lower greenhouse gas emissions based on 1990 levels by 2050.
It starts with utility companies because they are always the actors that push back, if you will, on trying to move towards more cleaner sources of energy. And so we mandate that they need to move to 100% renewable energy by 2035 in the utility sector, and then in all sectors by 2050.
Despite these strong legislative forces, the renewable energy industry in the United States has been slow to get started.
You just have to try to get people to change their mindset. So I think that's probably the biggest hurdle.
Offshore wind power is a sustainable, renewable source of energy that does not release greenhouse gases or other pollutants associated with the non-renewable energy sources responsible for America's carbon output. Offshore wind has tremendous potential in the United States, but as of today, there is only one functioning offshore wind farm in the entire country, Block Island Wind. We are on the verge of an energy revolution. Renewable energies are the energies of the future. In the end, the planet's future will be determined by the decisions being made right now.
I really think the future is going to look a lot different than what it looks like today. Today we're on the leading edge, the bleeding edge sometimes, if you will. But You know, by the time all of you are my age, like I said, it's going to be a much different world.
Humanity has been using wind power for more than 2,000 years, harnessing the wind to move ships and power machines. In 1887, Professor James Blythe of Anderson's College in Glasgow, Scotland, set up the first electricity-generating turbine. Since then, we have made significant advances in turbine technology. When wind blows across the propeller-like blades of a wind turbine, it turns them around a rotor. This turns a series of gears, which are linked to a generator inside the turbine. The generator uses this movement to produce electricity, which is sent into the power grid. Offshore wind has been proven to be more efficient and reliable than its onshore counterparts.
So the efficiency of these turbines is a function not only of the wind, but also of the characteristics of the wind, as we talked about briefly before. Terrestrial wind is subject to air disruption associated with landform, okay? As wind moves across land and hits trees and mountains and so forth, it starts doing stuff like this. So if you've got a turbine going like this, and the air is going through this, that turbine is going to be speeding up and slowing down, speeding up, slowing down. So it's not as efficient as what you've got offshore.
The idea of offshore wind was originally conceived by Dr. William E. Hieronymus, a professor at MIT University, who first introduced the idea of large wind turbine platforms in 1972. This vision was realized in 1990, when a company called World Wind constructed and installed the first offshore wind turbine 250 meters off the coast of Nogersund, Sweden. The next year, Dong Energy from Denmark built the first offshore wind farm in Vindeby, Denmark, costing 75 million kroner, or $12.3 million US dollars. Next, in 1996, the Netherlands started constructing a wind farm in Lake IJsselmeer, the biggest lake in the country. Offshore turbines produce the majority of the wind energy for the Netherlands. With offshore wind becoming an efficient way to produce energy, Britain started to erect wind farms. Currently, the largest wind farm in the world is the London Array, with 175 turbines that produce 630 megawatts for the country, powering 500,000 homes. The farm was built in 2013, and it took 5.5 million man-hours to build.
I lived over there for a little while, and that's progressing. It's close to early 1990s or so is when they first put some steel in the water. United Kingdom is leading as far as how much megawatts are out there into the oceans, but certainly Germany is playing a big role in that as well. And they're moving forward. As a matter of fact, a lot of some of the ideas of spatial planning for our oceans, that is one thing that they did over in the United Kingdom, where they identified specific areas out in the ocean that they were interested to have these facilities, and then went out to tender to find developers that might be interested in that on a competitive basis. And so the United States has taken direction to look at them and how they've advanced it and what we can do. Going forward, as the market develops here, certainly there's other lessons we can learn from workforce development, and it's a big issue over there as well, in particular in the British Isles, of what they can do to have the jobs and the manufacturing be created in country as opposed to on continental Europe. As far as at a global level, Europe is the epicenter of offshore wind and how it's developing, and there's some reports out there that are looking at the cost of offshore wind over time and how it's advanced. And thanks to Europe taking the lead on that, and as offshore wind develops here in this country, they're going to get the benefits of it as well. There certainly is a trend right now for the turbines to get bigger. And by getting bigger, they can generate more electricity. They can go further out to sea so that they can access higher capacity factors or higher wind resources that are out there.
Constructing an offshore wind farm is no small task.
Additionally, installation is way more expensive, partly because of mobilizing specialized ships. Maintenance is much more expensive. But in Europe, where most of the world's offshore wind is, the prices have been going steadily down. The United States, it's still very expensive because basically it hasn't been done before. There's a lot of risk.
Offshore wind farms take 2 to 6 months to complete, depending on their size. Since the idea of offshore wind in America is still relatively new, We rely on Europe for help.
The first projects will most likely get built with a mix between skilled European labor and Americans. The wind turbine companies, and these are the ones who manufacture the wind turbines, who have a lot of experience building, installing, and maintaining these wind turbines in Europe. It's a very highly trained job. But I think they recognize that that's a service that has to be performed by people in the US. So they're invested for their benefit, in having people know how to do that locally. So most likely for the first projects, there'll be some European skilled positions that'll get brought over. But in addition to doing their job that they're required to do of building and maintaining, they'll also be training some of the American workers as well to essentially replace them. To building up a skilled local workforce.
And also you have to think about what it takes to build it. So to get all the parts from the factory to an onshore location, we have trucks, right? There's an endless amount of trucks in the US. But to build an offshore wind farm, that requires like special types of ships. And in the US, we don't have those, and like Europe has them, but we haven't needed them.
After a wind farm is constructed, workers are still needed to perform maintenance on the turbines. Turbines, like all machinery, run the risk of breaking. Compared to onshore wind, maintenance for offshore wind turbines is much more difficult because of their location.
The types of projects we're looking at are going to happen and get built in the Massachusetts wind energy area, south of Martha's Vineyard, on a scale of probably 50 wind turbines, or about 400 megawatts. What would most likely be a staff of 24 maintenance technicians would be required. That's sort of a number that we were quoted by one of the wind turbine manufacturers. That's just the maintenance technicians themselves. Then there's people who are, working in they maintain a warehouse, sort of a parts warehouse. They've got everything available for when they need it. So people are doing the inventory, people, maintaining those parts, people sort of in the front office, kind of doing the monitoring, all of the bookkeeping, and just sort of the basic jobs like that.
Using Europe's expertise as an asset will be helpful while building offshore wind farms in the United States. Following their lead and using their technology will greatly help the renewable energy market in America. Although the industry is growing across the globe, offshore wind farms in the United States haven't had the same success as their overseas counterparts. Cape Wind was a project slated to be the first offshore wind farm in the country. Proposed in 2001 as a 130-turbine farm in Nantucket Sound, Cape Wind was led by Project Director Jim Gordon of Energy Management Incorporated. Discussion about the wind farm began in November of 2001, but work on the project was halted for several years due to the strong resistance from the coastal community.
When Cape Wind initially proposed their project, they suffered because there really was no process. There was no set regulatory path for them. So as a result, they had to go through lots of different hurdles, and they'd have to go back and then redo analysis over and over again.
Cape Wind faced a great deal of regulations and permits during the developmental process.
They submitted a proposal to what was then the Army Corps of Engineers, which was the sort of default federal agency that was tasked with being the permitting entity. The Army Corps is essentially responsible for activities in navigable waters, which doesn't necessarily really fit with where they were out in federal waters. So about 4 years later, in 2005, a different federal agency, the Minerals and Management Agency, got assigned to permit the project. So they essentially, all the work that had to be done had to get started over. But really what was happening was that, they were coming up with, how to deal with this, in real time. Because a federal agency, there's never been an offshore wind project in the United States.
You started seeing a lot of state reviews going on. The state approved the project, generally speaking, from an environmental perspective. And then it went through a process of getting a lot of the local permitting done, the state permitting for the transmission lines, which went through the Energy Facility Siting Board, getting approvals along the way, having some setbacks along the way, but seemingly on its way, regulatorily speaking, towards approval. The big thing then was selling the power and financing the project.
And on paper, it looked like a really good project. It was in state waters, so it had less regulatory hurdles. It was kind of protected from the full brunt of the ocean by being in the sound. It was shallow water. So from an engineering perspective, it looked like a great place to put some wind turbines. It's a really good example of developers not considering kind of the impact it would have. Other than that, it's a sensitive ecological area. There's very wealthy landowners nearby. So what looked like a good project on paper just wasn't really fully thought out.
With the purpose of opposing the Cape Wind project, Audra Parker joined the alliance in early 2003 and is now its president and CEO.
And it really started as kind of a grassroots venture with some fishermen, some marina owners that thought that Nantucket Sound was a really, really poor place for an industrial power plant. And Alliance to Protect Nantucket Sound was formed at that point in response to that, but with the long-term mission of finding some sort of vehicle for the permanent protection of Nantucket Sound as a national treasure worthy of preservation.
Save Our Sound had multiple concerns regarding the Cape Wind project, specifically the wind farm's potential impacts on the local economy and ecosystems of Nantucket Sound.
I'd say that it was threefold. One was sort of grassroots advocacy, which was just, educating people about why this is a bad idea. So, the flip side is the messaging was very simple. It's green is good and wind is free.
The scientific review around what the impact will be to the coastal areas, to fisheries, other wildlife, is something that definitely needs to be taken into account when deciding where best to put an offshore wind project. One of the unfortunate things that took place with Cape Wind, unfortunately, was a lot of myths that became fact because people kept repeating these myths and these, I don't want to call them scare tactics, but there were a lot of fear that was being spread around that just wasn't actual. It wasn't accurate.
Save Our Sound attempted to halt the progress of Cape Wind through numerous and extensive lawsuits.
A lot of lawsuits, every step in the road, challenging them, suing the FAA and winning, suing the Department of Interior for issuing the lease, suing Fish and Wildlife Service for violations of the Endangered Species Act. So a lot of litigation both at the state level and at the federal level. And that was quite expensive. And then the third piece was lobbying, like at the state and federal levels, trying to find legislation that might help the fight.
Save Our Sound attempted to halt the progress of Cape Wind through numerous and extensive lawsuits. Although they lost almost every lawsuit they brought forward, Save Our Sound put an immense amount of time and effort into supporting their cause, and eventually, after extensive legal battles, the project was officially retired.
You have to think about who and what you're going to be facing. What are the obstacles going to be? Where are the speed bumps? Where are the stone walls that you're going to run into? And proactively address those. I just got to say that because they were trying this stuff first, they just didn't have a roadmap. In many ways, the Cape Winds project provided a roadmap for this industry moving forward.
Cape Wind kind of shows the impact of how people just don't want to feel like they're being taken advantage of. Because I think that one of the issues with Cape Wind was that they didn't get public feedback early on. So people didn't feel like they had input in what was happening to their land and their community. And so then I think that the community really had this huge backlash because they felt like somebody was coming in and telling them what to do. And everybody in the world hates being told what to do.
There were all these benefits that they could line up, but they were kind of lining them up as they went versus this idea of looking at a project from the get-go and saying, well, what are you going to do to benefit the local community? Because I think everybody realized that, again, through Cape Wind, if you don't get, buy-in from the local community, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle the whole way through.
Despite the struggles faced by Cape Wind, other developers set their sights on new frontiers. Block Island is a popular tourist attraction and vacation destination off the coast of Rhode Island. Officially named New Shoreham, this small town has a close-knit, year-round community of 1,000 residents. Summer is the busiest season for Block Island, during which tourists provide the majority of the income for local business owners.
Well, I think it's great. It's, quiet in the winter. We have 1,000 people year-round and really, really busy in the summer. We have about 15,000 people on any given day, so it changes a lot. So it's a very it's got a big dichotomy in the number of people and the things that are open and activities. So, yeah, mostly it's, I would say the economic engine of the community is tourism, although there's a lot of construction, a lot of service industry as well for the year-round people. But a lot of these tourist-related businesses that are run maybe not by year-round people certainly put a lot of money into the overall economy.
For over 100 years, Block Island had their own electrical grid separate from the mainland, using generators to power the town.
Block Island was dependent on diesel generators that burned 1 million gallons of diesel fuel a year. And we paid some of the highest prices for electricity.
The previous rates using the diesel generators were directly related to the cost of oil. And the cost of oil over the last 15, 20 years has fluctuated up and down. At one point, we were paying over 60 cents a kilowatt hour.
The generators were located in the middle of the island, producing noise and air pollution. Block Island had been looking for alternatives to their diesel usage for years due to the price and ecological impact.
Block Island prides itself on being an ecotourism destination. We're very proud of our environmental record, and to be burning diesel fuel in the midst of this beautiful island was an anathema to us.
In 2009, the state of Rhode Island designated Deepwater Wind to begin pilot projects involving the construction of offshore wind. Block Island was selected as a viable location and the permitting process began.
Initially, we sent out a very informal survey to our members. And this was really, at the very beginning. And we got a very mixed bag. About half of our members were very much in favor of the project and half weren't. But at that time, there weren't a lot of details that were available. And so my assessment is that the people who were against it at that time just didn't have enough information.
Obviously, before this project, there had never been an offshore wind project in the United States, but there was clearly potential for the Northeast corridor to be a hotbed of activity for that kind of development.
Many islanders wanted an offshore wind farm off of Block Island, especially with the conditions present on the east coast of the U.S. Determined not to meet the same fate as Cape Wind, Deepwater Wind worked with the community to avoid potential pitfalls.
You had Cape Wind was kind of blocking up the works, and every time anybody talked about offshore wind, you really had to start from the question of, well, are you talking about Cape Wind or are you talking about something else? Whereas Block Island could point and say, Massachusetts is that whole Cape Wind thing. This is, different, and we're doing things differently. And they, I'm sure, learned from the public input process that happened in Massachusetts about how to do it differently and how to do it more smoothly and with a little less contention as they looked at the various issues that came up. But again, even off Block Island, there were people who were not for that project, so it's not without opponents.
As the Block Island Wind Project moved forward, it was shaping up to be a successful wind farm, but some still had reservations.
We weren't sure exactly what it was going to do for Block Island. We weren't sure exactly how big the turbines were going to be, how many there were going to be, how close they were going to be, what view they were going to be in. So it was mostly an aesthetic that we were worried about. And also there was a concern about a big company like Deepwater Wind that nobody had ever heard of coming to our little island that's pretty close-knit community, and we didn't know this, sort of like a big Goliath corporation coming to this small town, and so there was a little uneasiness about that and how we were going to get treated.
To combat the community's uncertainty, Deepwater Wind vowed to avoid the mistakes of Cape Wind.
One of the things that I think is really great that Deepwater Wind, the people who developed the Block Island project, really worked on a lot of community involvement, community outreach, and providing benefits to the community.
It was a gradual shift. The project took 8 years to get up and running. Many different stages. Deepwater Wind, the company itself, did a very good job of community outreach. They had several sessions out here discussing what's going on. It was a state project. So there were a lot of public hearings. There was some initial legislative issues that had to be corrected at the State House. Many of us went and testified at the public hearings. So did we get a chance to vote? No, but we certainly had an opportunity numerous times to let people know what our thoughts were.
The Block Island Wind Project began commercial operations in December 2016 and made history as the first offshore wind farm in the United States of America. As a successful demonstration project, the Block Island Wind Farm has garnered international interest.
That was our intention all along, was to, prove to a very large audience that this is viable in the United States, a viable industry in the United States. A lot of people were holding their breath and crossing their fingers and their toes and their eyes, hoping that we would succeed. Because once people could see the physical reality of the wind farm, we were a huge step forward in terms of having being accepted by a much broader audience. That includes states up and down the eastern seaboard, in and around the Great Lakes, and on the Pacific Rim over there.
Block Island has experienced benefits from the wind farm since its operation. After the turbines began harnessing the wind's energy, the diesel generator units on the islands were shut off.
It was a great morning, let me just start off by saying, because the island had to suffer from the noise pollution and also, of course, the air quality issues, which probably weren't as obvious to the casual passerby as the noise pollution was.
May 1, 5:30 in the morning, they turned the diesels off, and the next sound you heard at the site was the sound of birds. The first time in 125 years that birds could be heard on the property.
It was an interesting morning because the employees who worked at the power company have kind of thought of these engines and turbines, the gas turbines, as their babies, and they cared for them, and they fed the island with electricity for really since 1925. So, a lot of these workers have been in their jobs for 30 and 40 years. So to actually shut the turbines down and know that they're not going to come back on except for an emergency, it was emotional for a lot of the workers. The island residents who came down to witness it, it was more of an exciting morning, but it was pretty rewarding.
With this success, the wind farm could provide the residents with access to cleaner, more affordable energy. But some residents were fearful while transitioning to offshore wind power. No one knew if the turbines would help or hinder tourism, which could severely impact their local economy and daily lives.
Now that, because it's the first offshore wind farm in the country, there was no known. We didn't know if it was going to affect tourism or not. So it was a big question for us. What's going to happen? We did hear a lot of people saying, "I'm never going to go there again. These things are going to be so ugly. I'm never going to go." Or we heard people say, "That's really cool. I'm going to go check out this first wind farm in the country." So now that we've had one summer, because Block Island is super seasonal, right? We have a 10-week season. We have to make all of our money, and we see all of our visitors in about 10 weeks. So now that those 10 weeks are past, we were able to sort of study it. People came in and studied how it affected tourism, and if anything, it drove tourism. So that was a positive.
It's become a tourist attraction. There are interstate navigation is taking tours out there in the afternoon during the summer on their high-speed ferry. We've had groups from Maine come down and talk to us about what's going on. And we've taken them out on the site. It's really impressive to be out there.
We had the first windmills off the coast of the United States, and it affects Block Island, and we're part of all that marketing, and people are coming here to see them. So I think people realize the positive was much better than any negative that they thought might happen.
There's at least 3 people on the island now who are trained or being trained to do different things on the wind turbines. Brian Wilson, who's more the project manager, but also Robbie Gilpin has been doing a lot of training for climbing the tower and working on some of the systems that are on the tower, because there's a lot of stuff there like cameras and avian radar units and cranes and things like that. There's a lot of mechanics on each one of those, and he's very good at that, so they've been training him to do that. He goes out and does a lot of that. There's a local fisherman who goes out and does a lot of work in terms of operating the crew vessel to get to the turbines.
We haven't really had any hiccups. We haven't had, we've been powered by the wind farms now for a few months, and it's been going well. We have lights on.
There are definitely some people who feel very impacted by the view. Most of those people are people who have property on the bluff looking directly at them. I would say I don't know of anybody else other than a handful of people who look at them, whose properties are at the southern edge of the island, who are complaining about the view. I really don't. I mean, obviously there's an impact of the view, but I don't think people are reacting negatively to that, with the exception of maybe a handful of homeowners who have property right on the edge of the island that looks in that direction.
After the turbines were constructed, Deepwater Wind built a cable to connect them to Block Island. The 21-mile-long cable passes through New Shoreham on the way to the mainland. Luckily, the residents haven't given up on their possibility of having quality internet.
The cable to the mainland is a positive effect, because as you may know, that within that cable there's fiber optics. And we're in the process of trying to figure out how to take advantage of that with a broadband system for at least the major public buildings and eventually all the houses and residents on Block Island.
Overall, the turbines completely replaced the residents' expensive diesel generators with a new, eco-friendly, and renewable energy source. It was a big change for a small island, and they all felt the impact in their own way.
I think here on the island, the community is so small, because it is on an island, that everybody got to see the direct switch between fossil fuels and renewable energy.
With the Block Island Wind Farm established and operational, everyone is looking to the future and to a newer, greener America.
I think the future of offshore wind is bright, very, very bright. I think, you can't predict the future. And if you asked me that question many years ago, I probably would have been wrong. I would have thought the Cape Wind project would have gone forward. I would have thought we would be more advanced than we are, particularly given what the Europeans are doing.
With what we're expecting for the future of the number of projects we've proposed, we will over time begin to see an industry build out. Number one, offshore wind will be happening. It's the question of when and how much. But Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, all states have wind energy areas identified. They all have proposed projects. And really the question is,
so you've got major movers and shakers in the world offshore wind industry now stepping up to the plate and proposing and developing projects. You have Massachusetts, which has a very large renewable energy standard, including offshore wind. New York State issued one as well. New Jersey, we're expecting them to act on their pre-existing renewable energy standard. Maryland, Delaware, Rhode Island, obviously. So you're seeing up and down the East Coast. I have friends up in Maine. There's Monhegan Island is proposing some of these turbines on floating platforms, the floating platform technology out there, which is pretty exciting.
Block Island Wind is only the first step in the right direction. We still have a long way to go toward maximizing the potential for wind energy.
Yeah, I absolutely think it's a great role model. It's a great model that I think some other island communities are looking at right now, like up in Maine. I know that there's a couple projects being proposed. The siting of a renewable project is the key to whether or not it's accepted or not accepted. In northern Vermont, there were some folks that were pretty attached to the Green Mountains of the Green Mountain State, and they didn't like the fact that the turbines were placed on top of the mountains.
New England has the potential for significant energy generation from wind. The high wind speeds on the eastern seaboard are ideal for the construction of wind farms. The more wind farms that are established, the more the industry and workforce will grow for Americans.
A number of third-party academic groups have laid out that we could grow more than 100,000 green jobs in the Commonwealth by transitioning to this kind of renewable energy between now and 2050. So that's another obviously important component to the bill. But I think the most important thing is the fact that we have a federal government that's not just doing nothing on the issue, they're doing everything they can to prevent us from moving to renewable energy, let alone 100% renewable energy.
Renewable energy is the energy of the future, and offshore wind farms are an untapped source of clean energy for the United States. Despite early opposition to wind farms, and even with regulatory hurdles, it will only be so long before wind turbines dot the capes and bays of the East Coast.
There is no question that renewable energy is definitely a part of our energy future. Now, how fast that moves and how much government encouragement that takes is still unknown. But there's solar projects and wind projects today that are economical and comparable to other sources of energy, depending on what that may be.
I think one of the benefits is there's steel in the water now, and just having people familiarity with the technology and having the capabilities to see what they look like, to get a sense of the scale of the facilities. Those are all some great successes that we can take from Block Island and apply for the projects going forward.
The future is bright with promise of offshore wind as an industry. With a strong example in Europe's offshore wind farms, and with Block Island wind paving the way, the United States is poised for a new chapter in energy production. We have the opportunity to build a stable future for our Earth, and offshore wind is the key to this new era.
Close my eyes, only for a moment, and the moment's gone. All my dreams pass before my eyes, a curiosity